This is GARIS Essays, that is 2-3-page opinion pieces on topics such as species dominance, the global state, politics, femtotech, religion, society and education. Written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. This is essay number 23, entitled Brad, Multi-ism, Culture Bashing and PC, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Abstract. This essay attempts to spell out how the rise of multi-ism, that is the ideology of the multis, that is multi-cultured people, will impact on the conflicting attitudes of culture bashing versus PC, that is political correctness. Brad and the rise of the multis. One of the great phenomena of our times is BRAD, bit rate annual doubling. That is the fact that the speed of the internet keeps doubling every 12 months, allowing increasingly sharp images taken by individuals on their cell phones and video cameras to be transmitted all over the world, thus making it possible for dictators to keep their oppressed populations ignorant. Of course, BRAD is not the only such phenomenon, but it's a major one and will have a liberating effect upon the planet, leading eventually to a fully democratic world and, in the belief of the author, a global state, Globa, G-L-O-B-A. When people can watch the media from all over the world and in a language they understand, that is, in a language that becomes increasingly global, almost certainly to be English, this will have a profound effect on people's minds, their mentalities, their attitudes. It will make them more that is, multicultured. This growing use of the term the world community, meaning the countries of the developed democratic world, which allows its citizens to receive the satellite television of the dozen or so top world countries, e.g. from the US, CNN, UK, BBC World, Germany, Deutsche Welle, France, France 24, Japan, NHK World, Italy, RAI International, etc. Nearly all these programs use English as one of their languages, and most young people in the countries of the world community can understand English enough to watch these TV channels. The political leaders of these world community countries are becoming increasingly conscious that a world opinion is growing, and that it's proving to be a formidable force that cannot be ignored. Gone are the days when a George Bush Jr. could snub his nose at the world and do as he wanted, for example, to invade Iraq to get its oil. In today's world, there are no real superpowers. Increasingly, the only real superpower is the force of global opinion. As billions of people watch the programs of the top world countries night after night, they are inevitably influenced by what they see. Television and the internet is a seductive medium, and as the resolution of the images being transmitted keeps increasing each year, thanks to BRAD, the more seductive it becomes. For most people, their opinions on world events are simply absorbed from what they see in the media. As the Nazi leaders at the Nuremberg trials said, "It was easy to persuade the German people to go to war. We had control of the German media." Only a tiny minority of people are opinion generators, the rest are merely opinion fodder. With this rather unflattering yet realistic picture in mind, it seems fair to say that billions of people around the democratic world, that is 2/3 of the world's countries, are being powerfully influenced by what they see on international satellite television. They are being multified, that is, being made more multi. Multis, by definition, are people who have lived in at least 2 different countries and are thus able to compare and rank the customs of the 2 cultures they have lived in. Monos, by definition, are monocultured people who have lived in only one country and hence are unable to look upon the customs of their own culture with the cold eye of a multi, and hence are usually unaware of the extent to which they suffer from the stupidity of their own customs. Monos are typically unconscious of the idea that there may be superior customs in other countries. They are unaware of them for the simple reason that they have not been exposed to them. These foreign customs are simply outside their life experience. In today's world, according to a BBC TV tourist program, about 500 million people travel internationally each year, and about 70 million people are working outside their home country each year. Hence, most first worlders have now travelled internationally and have had at least a taste of cultural differences. They've been exposed to the idea that there are alternative ways of thinking and living. Thus, due to BRAD, international satellite TV, and greater international travel, etc., more and more people are becoming multified. The attitude that monos are boring is becoming increasingly common, although still a minority one, but destined to become dominant. Culture bashing versus PC. As a consequence of this multification, a clash of values between the culture bashers and the PCers is growing. PCers take the view that one should be very diplomatic and positive towards people of other cultures. This attitude is very strong and common, for example, in the US. This is not surprising because the US is both a migrant nation and rather insular-minded by European standards. In a migrant nation, PC-oriented attitudes to new Americans makes a lot of sense. The new American migrants are welcomed into the US, fostered by a strong PC attitude that is held by most old Americans towards their new countrymen. This acceptance of foreigners is one of the great strengths of the American people, contrasting sharply with the racist attitudes of the Japanese people, for example. This appreciation of PC values is understood by the culture bashers and thought to be a good thing in its appropriate context. However, due to the much higher level of insularity of the Americans compared to the, for example, Europeans, who have been able to zap international TV channels for decades the way Americans can zap football channels, this PC attitude is thought by the usually non-American multis to be inappropriate when judging other cultures/countries from a multi perspective. To illustrate what is meant by this, let us take a concrete example. In the 1990s, a lot of Western researchers moved to Japan to take advantage of the country's rising economic power, Japanese salaries, and the possibility that Japan might become the world's dominant economic power that would attract the world's talent. The author was one such person. A decade later, nearly all those Western researchers had left the country, usually in disgust. They had become multis and had looked at Japan with their Western eyes and found many inferiorities, so many in fact that they voted individually with their feet by leaving the country. While they were there, that is over a period of about a decade, they complained bitterly about the many inadequacies of Japanese culture to such an extent that the Japanese labelled this criticism Japan bashing. In the zeros, after the first lost decade of 2, now 3, of near zero growth, nearly all the Westerners had left Japan and the Japan bashing stopped. Instead of bashing Japan, the country was largely ignored, which hurt the egos of the Japanese even more. They felt they had become ignorable by the Westerners. The Western multis, based on first-hand experience of life in Japan, felt they had the right to make comparisons between customs of the mostly two cultures they had lived in. Just as a native of a given country feels he has the right to criticize some of its customs simply because he is a native, so too do the multis. They have first-hand experience of living in multiple cultures and can pass judgment on their relative weaknesses and strengths. These multis then do not appreciate at all the negative reactions they receive from PCers when the multis culture bash verb. The tide has not yet turned, since the PCers are still very much in the majority, but the multi-minority is growing and has history on its side. More and more people are travelling and working overseas and being influenced by BRAD, international TV, etc. The wind is in their sails. Hence the PCers will have to come to terms with the more sophisticated attitudes of the multis and learn to think like them. Otherwise the multis will become increasingly hostile and condescending towards the PCers, treating them as interculturally ignorant and blind who prefer diplomatic lies to negative truths. The multis far prefer the company of other multis. Typically, when a multi and a mono interact, the multi finds the mono boring, limited, dull, ignorant, narrow-minded, etc. A typical multi-mono clash takes the following form. When the multi complains about the limitations of some culture, perhaps those of the mono hasn't a clue what the multi is talking about, because the mono has not had the life experience of having lived in another culture that the multi uses as a basis of comparison to denigrate what he sees as the inferior customs he's criticizing. The limited horizons of the mono are frustrating for the multi. A multi sees a mono as being limited as an individual due to the limitations of the monoculture that programmed him. The reason multis prefer the company of other multis, even if their respective culture sets do not overlap, is because each will know the other will have a sense of cultural relativity and be quite happy to culture bash. Culture bashing, that is, heavy criticism of the inferiorities of the culture being discussed, is taken for granted by multis. All multis do it. Think about it. If you're a mono, and most people are, imagine how your mentality would change if you had lived in at least one other country for a few years. Inevitably, you would compare and rank customs between your two cultures. That's inevitable. You would be much less likely to be PC with another multi whose culture set included the culture you are criticizing. You would expect the other multi not to be offended, since he would be able to look at his original culture with a cold eye, as much as would the criticizer. Consequences of culture bashing. As the planet multifies, culture bashing will increase significantly as people are exposed more and more to the cultural superiorities and inferiorities of the world's cultures that Brad will bring into their living rooms. This will have many consequences. For example, try to imagine how it will feel to be in a culture that is not even an also-ran. Nearly every cultural product of that culture will be done better by most other cultures. It's likely that many countries, that is more than 100 of them, will develop a sense of cultural inferiority if they continue to uphold their traditional values and attitudes. The younger generation, however, will be much more likely to reject what they see as the inferior customs of their own culture and adopt what they feel to be the best features of the growing global culture that they will get fed every night in their living room. It will be very difficult for monos of culture X to reject as X bashing, where X is some country, e.g. Japan as above, when a large majority of peoples from all over the globe come independently to the same conclusion that some cultural trait of country X is highly objectionable. When 95% of humanity rejects a given custom in a given culture, e.g. Arabian honor killing, African genital mutilation, America's gun culture, etc., that will make the citizens of that culture sit up and take notice. They'll be forced to. The global pressure will push them into the global line. This culture bashing will be painful while it lasts. Since I suspect that most readers of this essay will be American, let me make this idea concrete and give Americans a taste of culture bashing directed against American customs. My experience is that most non-Americans have few qualms about such criticisms, but mono-Americans will probably feel deeply wounded and angry. That's normal, and that is the point. Culture bashing is going to hurt, but it's an inevitable consequence of multification and eventual globification. What stinks about US culture? Well, it's a rather unsophisticated middle-class culture, a colony, lacking an old-world upper class who refuse to migrate. It's comprised of selfish, genetically self-selected individualists who uprooted themselves from their friends and communities and their motherlands to move to the US. This genetically based selfishness translates into a lack of caring towards their fellow citizens, resulting in the US being the only developed country in the world that does not have a national health service. It does not satisfy a basic criterion to be classified as a civilized country, because it does not even cater to the basic physical health of its citizens. Even after Obama's health insurance reform, there are still millions of Americans who cannot afford to go to the doctor and subsequently die prematurely. The Americans are so brutal in their mentality that they murder their murderers, with all the hypocrisy that connotes. Their hillbilly attitudes towards guns means that there are 30,000 gun deaths a year in the US, compared with 100 in Japan, because the Japanese had more sense than to give razor blades, that is guns, to babies, that is citizens. Each time a mass shooting occurs in the US, the rest of the world shakes its head saying, "The Americans never learn. They don't ban guns, so it'll only be a few months before the next mass shooting." Yawn. If the US wanted to apply for membership of the EU, it would be rejected on the grounds of being insufficiently civilized. Americans are obese. 2/3 of Americans are either overweight, that's a third, or obese, another third. American women are so fat as to be sexually repulsive, cock shrinkers, compared to Asian women's sexually attractive curvy slimness. Americans are still religious, believing 2,000-year-old Christless superstitions such as life after death, sons of gods, virgin births, resurrections, miracles, angels, and the like, and are sneered at by Western European intellectuals for that reason. America, to its credit, was one of the earliest democracies, but that is a two-edged sword. The American democratic system is presidential, in which the people get to elect the president, more or less, directly, in contrast to most democratic systems in the world, which are parliamentary, in which the winning party chooses the Prime Minister. In parliamentary systems, the leader is chosen by professional politicians who have some idea of what it takes to be a good leader, a competent politician. Under the American presidential system, it is all too easy for a popular idiot to be elected as president. For example, Bush Jr., the inarticulate fool whom the Europeans and Canadians despised, who consulted a higher power before embarking on his unilateral oil-grabbing war. The US president, the most powerful man in the world, should be a genius, not a fool. But Americans are so inward-looking that they don't see that their political system is in need of an upgrade. America's unconscious arrogance, its economic, political and military dominance of the 20th century will make it very difficult for Americans to cede sovereignty and join a larger political/economic bloc, similar to the EU, if it is to remain a player in the billion club 21st century. The slower the US is in doing this, the quicker it will be its fall into an also-ran status, as the giants of China and India leave the US in their dust. America's television is ad-infested, dumbed-down shit. It's under corporate control, and hence it is used to maximize profits coming from advertising aimed at the peaker majority. Peakers are the people of average intelligence, lying in the peak of the IQ bell curve. This ad-infested TV ignores America's intellectuals, or sages, so they feel alienated from the culture and are less well informed compared to citizens of countries where the state provides TV and radio channels that cater to their higher IQs, for example France's France Culture, etc. The US abuses the Arab countries due to the wildly disproportionate power of the Zionist Jews living in the US, half of the world's Jewish population. The US spends half of its annual foreign aid budget on Israel and Egypt alone to keep Israel, that is stolen, colonized, occupied Palestine, as a military base, in case the Arabs decide not to sell the US cheap oil. The Americans are unconsciously arrogant. They have been globally dominant for half a century and have forgotten how to listen to the superiorities of other cultures. Their mentalities are inwardly directed. For most Americans, the other 95% of the world outside the US barely exists. This is due largely to America's peakerist, corporatist television. Americans are amongst the most nationalistic in the world. If a group of globists, people bashing for the establishment of a global state, that's people pushing for the establishment of a global state, jeered during the playing of the US national anthem at, for example, a rock concert, they would be more likely to be lynched than be understood. That is, the nationalistic US public would not understand what the globists are pushing for, namely the replacement of the sovereign nation-state system, that is always spending huge amounts of money preparing for the next war, by a democratic, war-free, global state, etc., etc. In my second book, I spend the first half of it trying to spell out the pros and cons of a handful of leading cultures, trying to make my readers conscious of the idea that the monos have a lot to learn from the multis. The multis are trying to teach the monos what they suffer from, that they suffer from adhering to their inferior customs. If you think I was being harsh on the Americans above, have a look at what I said about the Japanese and the Chinese, where I have also lived. I lived 5 years in the US. My first working day there was 9/11, 2001, the day the Arabs took revenge on the US for its criminal abuse of the Palestinians. Well, I don't think they'd take that view anymore. No, I just see 9/11 as a false flag by the Jewish elite, Mossad, and so forth. So the Jewish elite controlled US government killed, murdered 3,000 odd Americans in the World Trade Centers. That's my more modern view. Anyway, the day the Arabs took revenge on the US for its criminal abuse of the Palestinians. To most multis and to too few Americans, e.g. Chomsky, it's the US that is the greater terrorist. As the planet multiplies and globifies, it's likely that a global consensus will emerge concerning the relative status and attractiveness of the world's top cultures. If you asked me to choose my top 5, I would say, in decreasing order, US, Germany, UK, France, Japan. I've lived in the US, UK and Japan and can speak fluent German and French, Deutsch and Français. If you were to ask me for my bottom cultures, I would say the Arabs and the blacks, that is the poorest, least democratic and least developed on the planet. And I should add now, because this essay is quite old, also the dumbest. Blacks are the dumbest people in the world. There are 1 billion black Africans with average IQ of 70, according to dozens of research studies. Arabs average IQ 85, which is the world average. As the prevalence of culture bashing increases, being near the bottom of the global pile is really going to hurt. In the case of the Chinese, for example, it will be particularly painful because 90% of non-Chinese today live in democracies who look upon the Chinese government as a bunch of thugs who have killed more of their own people than Stalin or Hitler, who send off to Laogai, Chinese slave labor camps, any Chinese who criticizes the Chinese government. Such pain will eventually force the Chinese to democratize and subsequently live happier lives. Hence, culture bashing in this case could be considered as an example of tough love that comes from the world community parent who castigates a backward child. Bio. Prof. Hugo de Garis is author of the Artelect War, Cosmos versus Terrans, a bitter controversy concerning whether humanity should build godlike massively intelligent machines. And second book, Multis and Monos, what the multicultured can teach the monocultured towards the creation of a global state. In parentheses, both available on Amazon.com. Before retirement, he was director of the Artificial Brain Lab at Xiamen University, China. Both those books now you can read for free on my website, and pretty soon I will video them on and put them onto YouTube and other platforms. I'll do that in the next couple of months. Now being August 2017. Ciao.